So I thank all of you for coming, making time to listen to this presentation. And I also want to thank Bonnie Morris, Dr. Bonnie Morris, for giving this lecture. Um, Bonnie is currently a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and she's the author of 16 books, including the Women's History for Beginners, which was broadcast on C-SPAN, her book, The Feminist Revolution, which we have at the library, was selected by Oprah magazine as a top reading for Women's History Month, and she has taught women's history for over 25 years at various universities, and has been a guest lecturer for the Library of Congress and the State Department. With that, I would like you to welcome Bonnie. Thank you, Bonnie.
Hello, hi, okay. A great celebration of the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote in the United States has unfortunately been sidetracked by the COVID pandemic, and also for me now, the wildfires in California. So I'm actually, I've been evacuated from my home, and I am staying with my cousins. So I'm actually coming to you from a different home from where I live, with just what we could stuff into our cars as our possessions, my mother and myself. And it's very scary, but we are safe. We're here with our cats. I managed to take most of my archives out of our home. And I was very happy to have this scheduled, so I had something positive to look forward to. I might add that as we were driving away from our home, ordered out by Cal Fire, the last email I got was an invitation to have my next book published. So the show goes on, you know what I'm saying? So all this is to apologize. I don't have my normal blazer and all of my props. And nonetheless, this is a talk I've done many times, including on Olivia Cruz's, and which I enjoy very much. So just be aware, I'm going to drink a lot of water because the air quality here is the worst in the world right now. And it's been several days of packing and racing and being afraid. And yet here I am smiling at you wonderful people. I'm grateful to Virginia for the invitation, the library, which had to change from live to beamed, and Lisa, who set me up very nicely. And it all came together. So let's talk about suffrage. So I've taught women's history actually for almost 35 years, and I have a PhD in women's history. And one of my favorite lectures at various schools where I've had the privilege of being a professor is this. What were some of the arguments for and against suffrage, and how did feminists deal with those arguments? And what I hope is that in looking at the way that first wave feminists fought for the vote with arguments they had to cleverly turn and turn again, we might get some insights about the ways we're being told how to vote, or we don't need to vote, or don't, you know, trust the vote, or any of those things in this election year. So some of the arguments that smart feminists of the past offer to us are very important now. And it's easy to see that there are still similar attitudes all these years later about female intelligence, stamina, gender roles, all of that. So the first thing I like to start with is that the feminist movement didn't really begin with suffrage. It really began with frustration after the American Revolution, that American women were not written into the new laws of the new country. They had the same second-class status they'd had before, even though many had sacrificed everything for the American Revolution to be a success. Women were still under the power of husbands and later sons. They didn't have the right to own property. They certainly couldn't vote, serve on a jury, control their own money, attend most schools. They were never independent of a man. They couldn't divorce without automatically losing their children. They really didn't have many options of leaving an abusive marriage, nor did they have access to testify in a court of law. They were not considered reliable witnesses. And that goes all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon. So these are laws from past societies that migrated all the way from the Middle East to the Mediterranean, Judaism and Christianity, and white colonial settlers in the Puritan colonies to the American Constitution, and even now. Okay. So women began to argue about what were they able to do with their limited power to make the new country stronger or to play an important role. And over they were told, well, the best role for you is to be a good mother of sons. And if you're a good mother of sons, your sons will become presidents. You don't have to be a president. Why would you want to be a president? Your sons will be politicians. If you have 10 sons, you could raise 10 presidents. Isn't that better? Isn't that more of an influence? That's called Republican motherhood. And women who fought for various kinds of changes over and over heard this argument. Sacred motherhood is a gift to you from God. That's what you're here to do. Who wouldn't want that role? And women very cleverly turned that argument around and said two things. If you want us to be moral and instructive mothers in the home, let us have an education. Let us have educated motherhood, at least so we can read the scripture to our children. Open the schools to us. Let us improve our minds. There's so much we can do in addition to the housework that would make the home an uplifted sphere. So if you want us to stay in the private sphere, let it be the best possible one. And that did start many a school for some women who went on then to start schools of their own. The other argument was that if sacred motherhood is such a value, what's going on with slavery, where mother and child are sold apart from one another? Motherhood is perverted through the abuse of the slave mother by her owner, and children are waiting on their own fathers as sons of masters, enslaved, born into slavery. And all of this was, of course, very risky to talk about. And many were the responses from shocked pastors, really very early, like in the 1830s, that women shouldn't be talking about these things. The mere act of bringing it up made you questionable. Your character was questioned if you dared to speak about sexual assault. So there was almost no way to address what happened to women. Nonetheless, white women who were keen on reform joined many abolitionist groups fighting to change conditions for slave women and to ban slavery altogether. And here's where we kind of start. Two very active abolitionists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, were sent to the World Anti-Slavery Convention to represent the good work they had done trying to overturn slavery. London, 1840, they arrived to be part of this global convention of anti-slavery activists, and they're told you can't go in, women aren't allowed. Women cannot go in, women cannot speak, stay out. And they looked at one another, well, I wasn't there, but let's say. And this is when the penny drops. And they say, you know, we cannot make any kind of contract or rent a hall or be on a podium or publish without a man's permission. So if we could have a women's rights focus and empower ourselves to make change in the law, maybe as voters, then we could have a more direct role in challenging slavery and we could become representatives ourselves. So they come back and plan the famous Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. So that's the backstory. At that convention, women and men, including Frederick Douglass, make a long list called the Declaration of Sentiments, based on the Declaration of Independence, of the grievances women had against the state. They were not against motherhood. They were not against the sacred roles of, traditional womanhood. And what they wanted to point out was that all of the things that were promised to Americans were denied to women. And that women too had souls, had aspiration. Women also, if they were supposed to be these moral agents, could really improve the country if allowed to vote. So there was a huge focus at the Seneca Falls Conference on suffrage. But that was not the only issue. And it's important to note that while everyone began to get a sense of suffrage as a single issue, many women left determined to address other spokes on the wheel. Some, quite a few, devoted to the temperance movement because they saw male alcoholism as a big problem with battery and women's not having security if husbands drank up the wages, which women did not control. Other women were interested in education, in uplifting the poor, in focusing on getting women into medical colleges so they could contradict some of the myths about female fragility and hysteria. And notice that we still use the term hysterical in contemporary university hospitals. When a woman has to have her uterus removed, that is called a hysterectomy, yes? We're still using the ancient Greek that presumes a woman is dominated by her uterus and given to emotional waves that make her unstable intellectually. Well, that attitude was loud and clear in the 19th century. So as soon as women leave this convention and go on to be activists for the next 80 years, they meet with a host of arguments about why feminism was bad and why suffragists were evil and crazy and sick and wrong. Let's go through those arguments, shall we? Okay. First, the pro-suffrage arguments. They're pretty basic. People like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, whom one of my students in her exam referred to as Lizzie B. Stanton and Susie B. Argued women wanted the same natural rights that men want and were supposed to be guaranteed by the Constitution. So one argument was women want the same freedoms to fulfill themselves as men. And the second argument was women want to improve society, as do men. Let women vote, they'll make the US better. In some ways, that was a dangerous argument because it lurched into the essentialist vibe of women are better than guys, or they're more moral, or they will improve society because they're not as corrupt, they're more honest, they're naturally pacifist, the maternal instinct will guide the nation. That excited a lot of people, but it hurt women in the long run because there were many men who said, oh my God, if these women vote, they're gonna shut down the saloons, they'll, in the words of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, turn every public space into an everlasting parlor and nursery. They will have authority over men, which the Bible says no. They will reduce men's fun by banning not just alcohol, but gambling and brothels. They will mommy us to death, and that kind of superior moral vibe we would love in the home when you're rocking the baby. We don't want it in the public sphere telling men what to do. So the argument that women would improve the country if they could bring their particular qualities into public life was a slippery slope. But these are the two arguments. Women leave, and men, the first Women's Rights Conference and argue that it is rightful for women to vote, and it's a good deal for the country if women vote. It must be said at this point that there were indeed some feminists who were certainly not abolitionists, downright racists. And the downright racists were the ones who argued, I think I was suggesting that we're in this particular summer as well, we're very much looking at the racist roots, unfortunately, in feminism, whereby there were many suffragists who used what's been called the expediency argument, that it would be great if white women voted because they'd cancel out the vote of newly freed Black men. That argument was embraced by a lot of people, including convincing some Southern Democrats, legislators, to support suffrage. It was not limited to being hostile to newly freed men. It was also an anti-immigrant argument. It was very hostile to, let's say, Irish men. It was anti-Catholic. It was hostile to anyone who was coming to this country and as a man could be naturalized as a citizen rapidly, whereas women whose families had been in the country for generations couldn't vote because they were female. So it's important to note that there were people who pushed for women to vote to, quote, cancel out the vote of undesirables. Ouch. That argument really takes off in the 1870s after the Civil War, when we simultaneously have a lot of tension about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and the automatic rights to freed slaves. The 15th Amendment gives all men the right to vote, including black men, but it puts the word male out there, making it clear black women and white women are excluded. In that same era, we have a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. The Chinese must go. There's a Chinese Exclusion Act. And there's dissent about the citizenship status of all the new peoples the U.S. dominates after the Spanish-American War, when the Philippines and Guam and Cuba and Puerto Rico become U.S. territories, and Hawaii also becomes a territory. So added to the freed population are immigrants coming through Ellis Island, South Asian and Pacific Islanders, Jewish immigrants fleeing the Tsar, including my ancestors, people who are fleeing famine in Italy and Ireland. All of this gives some feminists fodder for a voting argument that is positioning white women as superior. I'm uncomfortable having to share that as a historian and looking at those cold facts. Okay. So again, the two major types of pro-suffrage arguments. We have a right that men do and will improve the country for various kinds of reasons, let's just say. Okay, now the fun part. What are the big arguments against women voting? And boy, I just never get tired of this. As women begin to go state by state, or in national suffragist groups, in small towns and big cities, as they develop a media, a lecture tour, colors, postcards, a material culture of suffrage, here's the pushback they get. Number one, women belong in the home. God wants it that way. Anything else, you're a blasphemer. Really hard to talk back to that one, especially as many women were not permitted leadership roles in the church or to go to divinity schools until later. So the biblical argument is very powerful. There are many passages in Corinthians, and my goodness, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, I actually stood there in the temple of Ephesus where he proclaimed, wives are subject to the authority of their husbands. That women shouldn't have authority over men. And then later there's women be silent in church, which was interpreted as being silent in public. So there's a biblical argument. Eventually, that's edged out by a medical argument that women are too weak to vote, that rather than going strictly by divinely ordained sex roles, now we look at biology and human difference and science, and now doctors gain as much authority as ministers and priests and rabbis. And the new medical attitude is women are too hysterical to vote. They will become sick. They'll faint in the ballot box. Women are naturally nervous. They're naturally emotional. Men rule the head, women rule the heart. Women aren't stable enough to be good voters. They are built to execute the roles for which they were designed, to be mothers in the home, not to be public figures. They will become infertile. They will, including if they go to college or play sports. It's always those three: voting, sports, education at Smith, sterility. That was based on the idea, going back to Aristotle, thank you very much, that women have a limited amount of energy in the body. They lose some every month, and if you redirect blood from the uterus to your brain or your voting finger, you will undo yourself. Save the energy for early motherhood. So we have a biblical argument, a biological argument, the obey your husband, let him vote for you argument. Why would you vote differently from him? So then why do we need women voting? Every woman is going to be a wife eventually. If not, why not? Right? And so you're too delicate for a political life. Then there's the attitude, well, women are ignorant. Don't add ignorant women to ignorant men. And women responded, well, you're right. I'd like to get a political education, but you won't let me go to college. So if I go over to hear a political speaker and learn more about the issues and the slate, I have to leave the house and go to a whistle-stop tour or a speech at City Hall. But at that time, the late 19th century and into the 20th, many political speeches were held in men's clubs and saloons, and men did not want the wives in there. They resented having to cover the bar and put away the spittoon. So they turned that argument back on women. You want to come to a political debate where men are smoking and talking dirty and spitting? Why, you're abandoning your baby, and your child will grow up to be a delinquent. How dare you? Then there's the argument, if you are too educated, you will want to talk politics at the breakfast table, and that will disrupt harmony in the home. As industrial capitalism is making the factory work week a living horror for working men, the viewpoint was the woman is the angel in the house for a man who is beat down by his boss all day. He is master in his own castle. He wants to come home from horrifying labor conditions to a loving atmosphere, not to engage in political debate with his wife. So that was seen as a real destructive force for a woman to be almost her husband's rival in political dialogue. Another argument, you have the right not to vote. It's messy. People get drunk, they throw up. You're so lucky you don't have to. Yeah, I don't know about that. Men really held tightly to that right, but they use this argument, you have lovelier things to do. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, women are too wise to wrinkle their foreheads with politics. At the opposite end, first you have a very capitalist argument, let's say, that women could do more good through philanthropy and charity than voting. This was directed at women of wealth. You can make a huge difference. Start a women's college if you want one so badly. Donate to causes you believe in, and you'll make more change than if you vote. Voting is messy. And then Marxists argued, you don't want to vote. Working class men have not improved their lot. Why do you think you would? Why do you trust the government to make things better? Don't vote. Anarchy. So everybody had an idea why women shouldn't vote. But here's one of my absolute favorites. Women shouldn't vote because they don't serve in the military. Okay, juicy, yes? This one, this argument says women are not going to have the same rights because they don't have the same responsibilities. Men are drafted, they go off to war, they die. Women don't have to make that kind of sacrifice, and we don't want them weighing in on military matters. So there's a lot that's wrong with that. And I usually ask my students, what's the fatal flaw? And they come up with lots of answers. Well, women, maybe they want to fight. That's a good response. They're prevented from doing so. Given the opportunity, a lot of women do enter the military. We know women passed as men in order to fight in the American Revolution, the Civil War. Those are very famous stories. So it's not from lack of patriotism or wanting to. Second, I'll have a student say, women birth soldiers out of their bodies and send them off to die. That's the ultimate sacrifice. But that's not the answer I'm looking for. Other people say, well, it's ridiculous to think that if women voted, they would send men off to die when they don't have to. It takes an act of Congress to declare war, not women at the ballot box. It is true, though, that the first women in Congress, Jeanette Rankin, voted against the U.S. entering World War I, and she was the only one. She said, "I cannot deny my conscience. I vote no." There's a statue of her in the Capitol. But the answer I'm looking for is not all men serve, even if they wanted to. Men can't simply go to war if they wish. They have to pass an army physical. So a guy with one eye, does he still get to vote? Yes, actually. A guy who lost his trigger finger in a terrible farming accident as a youth, that was very common in the 19th century. Can't go to war, but can he vote? Sure. Flat feet, yes, you can vote. Older men who would no longer qualify for duty, they can vote. So it is true that in the 20th century, there were many groups that were not allowed to vote because they had a disability, and that included some people with specific physical disabilities, and the deaf, and Native Americans, and. But this argument is very exciting for my students, and usually, what'll happen is, one year there was a guy named Dave who had broken his leg in a skiing incident. He had a big cast on his leg. And I said, do you think Dave should vote? And they were like, why couldn't Dave vote? I'm like, well, he wouldn't pass his induction physical, would he? He's got a broken leg. Everyone got very excited about discrimination against Dave. But here we're talking about discrimination against women. So all of these arguments led to the long years of the suffrage battle. And by the time we get in the 20th century, it escalates. Most of you are familiar with the new younger tactics of Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, who had a very different vision that included direct action, picketing in front of the White House, being willing to be arrested for a public demonstration, challenging the president in wartime with angry signs. When sent to Occoquan Workhouse, they refused to wear the prison uniforms, saying they were political prisoners. They wouldn't eat the food and went on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed brutally. This is all info you can see in the film Suffragette and various documentaries. But I took my students to see the jail cells where those women were held, and the old bars were chipping off and rotting. So here's a little piece of Alice Paul's jail cell. Yes, I took this when I evacuated. I'm that much of a feminist, okay? So what we know is that there's a couple of things that made success in the early 20th century possible, where the same tactics might not have worked in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. It was very clear during World War I that women were useful, even indispensable. Many countries gave women the vote during or after World War I because without women's contributions, the men could not go off and fight. Women did all kinds of war work. They finished the harvests, and they were delighted to take off their corsets to do so. In fact, one rumor is that so many women's corsets with steel reinforcement were donated to the war effort. They yielded enough steel to build a battleship and freed women's waists to do what was admittedly very unhealthy war work, bending over phosphorus and making glow-in-the-dark watches and clocks for people to work, and for men in the trenches to set dynamite timers. Those women all developed cancer of the jaw. So women made so many sacrifices in health, and they were asked to do very masculine work, that they were rewarded in some ways with the vote. But there were definitely feminists who felt that women should not do any kind of war work or contribute in any way until they were given the vote. You want our help? Give us the vote. That was more of an acute position in Britain. It was almost a plea to women not to fatten the wallets of war profiteers. Well, you don't have any democratic rights. The official position in the U.S. with the National Women's Suffrage Association was to prove worthiness and gain the vote by being as good a contributor as possible with Red Cross work, helping to Americanize immigrants, saving, growing a victory garden. That permitted people to really see women's capabilities simultaneously. Things had changed because of the efforts along educated motherhood, the development of women's colleges, the Seven Sisters Colleges, Smith, Radcliffe, Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, Vassar, the Radcliffe, Barnard, Bryn Mawr, and the professions that those enabled women to enter meant that there were more women teaching and serving as physicians than in the earlier 19th century. All of those educated women were able to make fantastic, moving speeches. There were magazines. There was a birth control movement led by Margaret Sanger. One of the first young women to visit her clinic in the U.S. was my grandmother. Okay. And there were also challenges to labor laws that made it clear how much women were working as hard as men at 1/2 or 1/10 the pay. So there was a visibility about the phenomenon that although women were told they were too delicate to vote, they were not treated with delicacy in other places in life. They took the same risks, and their fertility was not taken into consideration when they worked in hazardous workplaces, nor were they expected to lie around eating bonbons or whatever the stereotype is in communities of color, where it was often women who found work ahead of men who were perceived as threatening to the racist mind. There you had women working in white women's homes, but you also had women doing what was considered men's work, everything from building railroads to testing dynamite. All right. I'm going to give you like 5 more minutes of history and then take questions because I could go on and on. In the different campaigns, what I generally do, as you see in the classroom, is trying to make sure that the broadest issues are addressed. And then there are, of course, many stories about individual characters, Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony, Ida Wells, the black suffragist who was told not to march in the parade with the white women, who led many campaigns to challenge lynching, which was endemic in the U.S. up to and including the 1920s and beyond. But what I want my students to be able to do, or any of you, is to be aware, if a microphone is put in front of you, to be able to turn back arguments that are presented today that sound terribly similar. The vote is unstable, we can't trust it, so don't bother. You can't make any change, don't try. But also the idea that women are emotional, unstable, that they vote in a specific way and only that way, they're reduced to definition by their ovaries or what have you. It's true that one of the interesting things we see, beginning, let's say, in the second wave of feminism in the 70s, 80s, there's more of an interest in sort of keeping track of what was called the gender gap. Did women vote differently from men? Many did. Women tended to vote more for issues that were related to health and welfare, funding for schools, children's safety. They were less likely to vote to put all funding into atomic weapons, let's say. But a curious thing that happens when women win the vote 100 years ago, it does not usher in a thrilling feminist decade. Many women are still suppressed as voters, primarily in minority communities. Many women don't go out and vote. Many women do vote just like their husbands. But the big issue, which no one ever talks about, it drives me insane. During World War One, we not only have a world war and a suffrage movement, we have a Russian Revolution. And although Russia is our ally in World War One, after the war is over, we become sworn enemies, we meaning the United States, of communism. And protests in the streets, strikes for better wages, demands for fair treatment, women asking for change in the workplace, quickly gains a no-win retort. If you don't like it here, move to Moscow, you're a communist. People did not call women commie sluts so much in the 19th century. The viewpoint in the 19th century was women were asexual and apolitical. That changes in the 20th. The name calling becomes much nastier, and now we know it's just horrific in social media trolling. It's very sexualized. This really begins in the 20s. Women who wanted to continue having public parades were turned back, or they were literally sent back to Russia or Eastern European countries. They were feared trying to overthrow the government. Anything that was an agitator's stance could now be termed, you're trying to overthrow the government, you go to jail, or you're deported. So because of the Red Scare and a quick immigration quota that halts immigration for years, women were interrogated, investigated, and silenced in what could have been a great moment of political freedom. And I think most of you know that women rolled all that energy over into something else, which was the kind of individual freedoms of the flapper movement. That was very much about personal freedoms to date, drive, drink, break some rules. But women had to be very careful. And it was very dangerous to challenge the government. So that's why when I put on the blackboard, I'm so old-fashioned, here's the first wave, and it goes from, the 1840s to 1920. And then the second wave of feminism starts around 1963. And my students say, well, what happened between 1920 and 1963? A great deal of Red Scare time and investigation of outspoken women, and another huge war and a civil rights movement. And it's easy to not see how all of these intersect, but you have to be alert to all of it. And not all of it is just, but all of it is interesting. And as much of it as you can learn, use this time while we're all at home to learn. And it was very revealing to me which books and papers I grabbed when I had to go. They were very much about my life in women's studies and about being an educated woman and the benefits that come to having a political education as well as a traditional ABC and algebra. So I'm going to stop there and take some juicy questions. And I know I've crammed a lot in. I just want to add, I think Lisa may put this up somewhere, but you can send me questions. I have a website, www.bonniejmorris.com. And you can get to my email through my Authors Guild website, and I'll write back to you. Be aware, I am an evacuee and a refugee right now, so it may take a little while before I get back to you, but I promise I will. And I would love to.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Get some questions? Okay.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And there are some questions. I will read them off, especially for those people who are dialing in and not on the computer. Marilyn asks, you may be about to discuss this, but there's been a lot of discussion and controversy in recent years about the relationships between Black women and Black women's suffrage organizations and white women, and organizations that were mostly by and for white women.
Yeah,
Sojourner, yeah.
I can see the
Okay.
question. Thank you for picking that one. I was just going, ooh, that's such a good question. Obviously, yes. Forgive me for not mentioning Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman's" speech, which really summed up while legislators were arguing that women shouldn't have the vote because they were so delicate and that chivalry should prevail. Those courtesies were not extended to enslaved women, and that's implied in Truth's famous speech. And there's another account where she gave a speech, and a man in the audience said, I don't believe you're a woman. I've never heard a black woman speak so well. I think you're a man in disguise, and I demand that a party of doctors and women take you backstage and undress you to prove that you are a woman." And in response, Sojourner Truth ripped open her blouse and said, quote, "Take a good look. These breasts have suckled many a white babe when my own went hungry. It's to your shame, not mine, that I show you these breasts now. So tell me, good sir, do you also need to suck?" They don't make speeches like that anymore. I would say that, yes, there was, as I tried to hit on, a great deal of division between racist suffragists and suffragists who came out of the abolitionist movement. And I think you would find that the same was true in the second wave. Second wave feminism borrowed enormously from the tactics of the civil rights movement, which had had tremendous female leadership, and where the main question, of course, was on race bias and identification with black male allies. So the main point of tension, well, one point of tension in second wave feminism was many African American women were reluctant to pile on the men oppress women bandwagon because they lived with men who were deeply oppressed based on race, and they did not want to make a primary alliance with white women who didn't understand the issues they were facing in their own communities. Simultaneously, it had been very difficult for black women to receive an education at the same time as white women, and it had been separate and unequal. But there were tremendous roles that women played in historically black colleges and universities that weren't familiar to white women. So that history was not known to white women, and probably the biggest error is the language. We need to reach out to include more black women. Well, that puts you in the pick and invite seat. Many women, though, who were primary authorities in second wave feminism included my personal favorite, Shirley Chisholm. Margaret Sloan Hunter became one of the first editors of Ms. Gloria Steinem made it a point never to give a speech without an African American woman speaker and writer at the same time. And a lot of this material is in books I can recommend. All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies. I'm going to forget lots of terrific texts I could recommend, but I can send you a reading list. So yeah, there's plenty of work to be done. And I address a lot of that in my book, The Feminist Revolution, and in Women's History for Beginners, and a couple other things. So.
And I put the link to your book in the chat box. So
egregious self-promotion, but honestly, they're a good read, and because other people seem to think so.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, another question. You mentioned the argument put forth that women's votes could cancel out undesirables like immigrants and people of color. How much of an influence did this argument really have?
That's a great question, because it's important to understand. We tend to, and I'm looking at Lisa here, we tend to leave Asian American women out of the whole story, and I'm sick of it. It's really important to know that because of the various acts passed in the 1870s and renewed in the 1880s and the 1890s, you could not become a naturalized U.S. citizen if you were Asian from anywhere until 1943, when we went to war with Japan. And then you could become naturalized if you were Chinese, Filipina. But the anti-immigrant sentiment was very much about Pacific Islanders, Asian immigrants, the Irish, the Italians who were seen as criminal. There was a bad word for everybody, including my Welsh ancestors. Everybody was seen as lesser than white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So that was very powerful. Somebody could scare up a community. These people are moving in, and they could be, Bohemian Hungarians, they could be Jews, they could be Irish Catholics, they could be um, African American free for the entire history they've been in the United States, or people with slave ancestry. A lot of the means through which people were encouraged to depress the votings of others, that was often sexualized. You don't want these people going to school with your daughters, so et cetera, et cetera. But I also think the expectation was that women were not going to get the vote. So they weren't assumed to have a whole lot of influence canceling out other men's. And these undesirable men, quote unquote, were suppressed at the ballot box. They were not able to exercise their right to vote. So both sides, you're not going to see a lot of minority men voting, and you're not going to see a lot of women using the vote to cancel them out. The racist attitudes are out there, however.
Okay, and then we have an 11-year-old who has a question.
Hi, go to college.
She says that she can't vote until she's 18, but she wants to know what she can do now to get involved and help make this country better.
You are so cool. The first thing you should do is start keeping a journal and keep it for the rest of your life. Look at this era you're living through. What did you think about it? What did you see? What did you watch? What did people say to you? Keep a record. Believe you're important. Consider the influence you can have, and you want to be able later to go back and look how you changed or didn't. Write your arguments down so that you can argue better. Write down and memorize. This is good advice for the AP exam too. I am the demon creature who grades those tests. Write down a couple of paragraphs that you can memorize that are really great arguments about the issues you believe in. Then if you have a chance to give an interview on TV, you won't panic and fumble. You'll have those memorized. Write your own one-woman play about girl power and start performing it on YouTube. Get your friends to do a reading of the Declaration of Sentiments and talk about who's left out or all the same issues we've been addressing. Petition your school to teach women's history or women's studies. Have me come into your school as a guest lecturer on Zoom. I'm happy to do it, and I work cheap. Make some new slogans that haven't been heard before so that you have something original to contribute. Be aware that you want to keep sane when people put hurtful arguments in your face, and you have to develop a really thick skin. There will be mean people who make fun of how you look or your body or your sexuality, because that's what they do to make women afraid of carrying on with your work. Just let it roll over you. You're fine, you're beautiful, you're normal, whatever. Whatever that is, you are it. So don't lose time and sleep being rattled by baloney. And I mean a different word than baloney, right? And finally, interview the older women in your family. Get their stories down. What battles did they fight? Or anyone in your family. This is so great that we all have these tools now of Zoom, and that you can order tickets from your phone. The first time I did that, I was so excited because it just seemed like something out of a futuristic comic book. And if you can get other women's histories down, you're a historian and you're an archivist. Make a note of who was the first woman to vote in your family, what's the oldest object in your kitchen that was passed down woman to woman. And then you'll start to realize that women's history is everywhere. It's in our material culture and in our dreams. Look out for that next book dedicated to you.
Thank you.
That is great advice for everybody. And speaking of making an impact in the community, I see that there's a comment from Margaret about the Los Altos History Museum, which has a suffrage exhibition right now.
Yay.
And it is outside. Docents are available from 1 to 3, Thursday to Sunday, and it's also self-guided.
You can go online. I'd like to also recommend, thank you for poking me about that. I'm an advisor to the National Women's History Museum, which is an online museum because we just can't get the government to break ground on an actual women's history museum in DC. But there's a wonderful online one, and I'm one of their advisors, and they have many resources for school work and girls to do history. You can do virtual tours of the Seneca Falls Museum, which is a national park. And there's also, of course, the African American History Museum. Most Googling will result in museums that allow you to take a peek. And right now there's a whole lot going on with the National Archives. I can't even choose among the bounty of riches in the 26th of August. And those are all events that are free that you can watch. And there'll be a few others later in September. I think there's also going to be a couple of, postponed events are going to roll over into 2021. Who knew? So one of the things I'm supposed to do is give a much longer and slower version of this at the National Women's Music Festival in Wisconsin next July 1st. So you can go to that event, and that will be days of women's history, fun, and music.
Will that be on your website?
Sure, I'm going to update everything. I was signed up to do so much this year, to have museum exhibits and speak all over the country, and of course, look what happened. But I'm very fortunate. I have all my work with me. Much of the speeches I do, I have as files, or I've written stories that are being published. And so it's all getting out there anyway. I just miss hugging you and being with other women. And I would add that it's challenging to be an advocate for some of these issues when there's so much hostility in our lovely land. And the advice that I gave just now is, I'm talking to myself as well, to engage in an argument across the aisle, or whatever you want to call it. People are blisteringly unkind to one another, and it's easy to become fatigued, and we just can't afford to get tired. So you have to have a means of chilling out. I was very much in a beautiful daily walking in the woods and writing routine, and now I'm going to have to learn how to chill out all over again because I'm in this wildfire situation. But if you have something that allows you to have a pleasurable stress relief, if you're going to be an activist, you have to have something. And for me, it's writing in my journal and walking on the beach and collecting sea glass, and reading my favorite books from childhood while eating sunflower seeds, putting a whole lot of bad for you stuff in my coffee. If I can do those things every day, woohoo, I will take on the patriarchy. But if for every person, it's something else. And that includes, you are not a punching bag. If people are hostile to you to the point of time for a lawsuit, that's a whole different level. Many women have suffered abuse to get us where we are today, so we have to be tough. We can't be shrinking violets. But we have to be honest about the toll that constant hostility takes on any person, and make a better world for people. I say that as a graduate of a Quaker high school. We majored in niceness while also being political activists, and it can be done. Also, I think it's important that young women and men learn about the Equal Rights Amendment and Title IX, because those are not instructed in every classroom, and they are the most important issues of women's rights in the 80s, 90s, and now. So that's my 2 cents on that too.
And speaking of the ERA, somebody does ask, what is the status of it now?
Well, I don't know how many additional states are necessary, but Virginia voted to ratify. I went door to door for ERA right out of high school, and I heard all of the arguments against it from scary people, some of whom sicked their dog on me and greeted me at the door with a gun or whatever. So there's a lot of feeling. It's great practice for running for office or something else I might do later. But I would say that a lot of people believe we have an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution already. And a lot of people believe that Title IX continues after you leave school. These are both inaccurate. My students are horrified to realize we don't have an ERA and that there's no guarantee of equal rights in the workplace. Many workplaces have their own rules, exceptions. Some are religious in nature. This is not a good time where many rights hard won are being rolled back. And it can feel like, wow, for my friends, we spent our entire lives fighting for issues that are really suffering. But that is nothing compared to my ancestors in, the Nazi Holocaust or people under the institution of slavery. It's not nothing, it's something. But my point is, I know how privileged a life I've had. I just can't stop trying. No matter how it seems like you're rolling that rock back up the hill. These are good conversations to have. It's a great time to reread the Diary of Anne Frank. Her biggest complaint, she's going to fall behind in her schoolwork. I read that to my students after 9/11. I was like, you know what? Scary, but don't, just do as much reading as you can. That's what others have kept up to be better word warriors in a time of horror. And I think there's also a sense of people getting closer because we're all stressed and sad. So it's good to know, who are your friends and check in with them. How are they doing? Getting away from suffrage here, but just know that I'm thoughtful.
Yes, yeah, another great piece of advice. It's 4 o'clock right now.
Let's take one more. Is that okay?
Okay, there are a
I'll
couple
go
of
on.
questions. So, let's see. One of them was, there's a lot of great advice here in terms of other books to read and a play. Somebody asks, what do you believe is most significantly missed in the time between the first and second wave, feminist wave, that we should be covering today in historical thought?
Wow, whoa, what a great question. I love World War I because it has everything, the Russian Revolution, suffrage, labor movements, women doing war work. And I love the 1920s because it's a terrific era to talk about anti-immigrant sentiment, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and how the public does not respond to quash lynchings. The Great Migration, which is to bring African Americans from the rural Jim Crow South to northern industrial work. Very important to look at the riots against their settlement in communities like Chicago and Indianapolis, etc. Detroit. I think the invention of the car gave women a whole lot of freedom, and prohibition made everyone a criminal. So women were able to test boundaries in the 20s because of those two aspects, which are really interesting. And there's a great book called Flapper which I recommend. That's a wonderful story about all of that. I recommend as well the Nazi Olympics, which were held in Berlin in 1936. And because it was such an unsafe atmosphere for Jewish athletes, the U.S. Olympic delegation opened up spots for many African American stars of sport who had been passed over. And they were able to not only gain fame and break records, but they disproved Hitler's master race theory, and they put the U.S. on the path of the civil rights movement, because we could hardly go to war against Nazism and showcase our greater democracy if these athletes and those veterans came home to segregation. So looking at how all those things are interwoven, that Roosevelt and Hitler came to power at the same time, the eugenics movement and scientific racism originating in the US, which Nazis borrowed for their tactics, going to war against those theories, but with a segregated war force. Women's role in Rosie the Riveter and the All-American Girls Baseball League. I brought my signed sweatshirt out of the house. That story of women in baseball is terrific, although it is, again, white only. In the 50s, everything about trying to suppress young people's sexuality, fear of interracial dating, the invention of film, which was censored so that you couldn't show an interracial kiss, and all of those storylines had to be done with white actors in bad makeup. All of those movies, Imitation of Life, Pinky, and the Lavender Scare of the anti-gay purges of the State Department and beyond in the 1950s with Senator Joseph McCarthy. All of those things should be on the AP reading list, or it should be, common information. When the first gay organizations begin in the United States, Mattachine Society, Daughters of Bilitis. And it should be also, to a degree, taught that there was a countercultural movement that pushed back against all of that, but that many people suffered terribly from being on these lists, forbidden to work, and having to use a fake name. Film is a great source for studying social change. But people should be aware of the production codes in Hollywood that ban open discussion of homosexuality, virginity, pregnancy, socially transmitted diseases, and interracial love.
Okay, thank you so much, Bonnie. For those of you who still have questions, I entered Bonnie's website address or URL again, so you can contact her through that. There's a lot of great information on her website, as well as things like recommended readings and other historical information.
Hold on 1 second. Mom? Myra? Yeah. Can you come in here and show your face on Zoom? I want you to see my mom, because it's very important for everyone to know that she's safe, we're okay, and that I owe so much of my love of learning to her tutelage, her taking me, pull the chair around, to the library when I was a little kid. My mother's the one who told me to look at the color of the men who removed our garbage in LA and why that was. My mother took me on peace marches from the time I was 5. My mother has always stood up for me as a lesbian in American culture and gone on parades and even to women's festivals with me. Move on in. You have to come in. You have to come over here. You have to come over here.
Hi, Mom.
This is Myra. Look in the camera. Lift your head. There we go. No, that's it. That's it. Smile. Look there.
I'm eating candy.
Smile. Okay. So everyone, remember your mother made you. And if you can, interview her, get her into a bunch of books, find out her story. My
She'll be
mother is
grateful.
a first generation American and the daughter of an immigrant. And a lot of the work we've done the past, well, yesterday, day before, was rescuing our, first family Americanization papers and other photographs. But here we are, we're okay. And in the end, we knew what was important. So
Well, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for
we thank you.
doing this through your evacuation and what you're going through. It's amazing. You're
Good
such a trooper.
distraction. I mean, we had been like, oh my God, our lives.
Quite a year.
Quite a year.